The mother church, just months after it had been completed and everyone was celebrating that there was this huge church which MCC filled with 1,000 people every Sunday, it was burned to the ground. And then, in the 1980s, came HIV and AIDS. And things became very bad indeed. And if it hadn't have been for our lesbian sisters, the church wouldn't have survived. No two ways about it. The church would not have survived. And I would also like to testify that there would be tens of thousands of gay men who would not be alive today if it were not for their sisters who stepped in and cared for them and fed them when no one else could.
Amen.
And this is a large portion of the history of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that is often not told. It's often not told, because the focus is on the gay men who have died in their hundreds of thousands, in their millions. But it would have been even worse if they had been alone. Now, we had one church in San Francisco that really summed up what happened. And it was called the Golden Gate Metropolitan Community Church. And it was a thriving church. 90% of its members died. And eventually the church closed itself. 90% of its members died. But out of this grief, out of this holocaust of loss, and I use that word advisedly, out of this holocaust, where an entire cohort of people, the youngest and brightest and best, were plucked out from amidst us. Great artists, great singers, great pastors were just taken from us. Out of this, something extraordinary happened. Now, there's a theologian called Stanley Hauerwas. Stanley Hauerwas is quite something. He's actually Anabaptist, and he's a straight guy. And he got himself into an awful lot of trouble about 15 years ago when he was writing one of his books, and if I remember it, Suffering Presence. And he said, the nearest thing I have seen to a functioning Christian community in the modern world is a gay community in San Francisco at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I have to tell you, it was not just a warm, glowing picture of kind people. It was people going beyond what was required of them, what anyone could have reasonably expected, and doing things which were truly Christ-like. It was bathing the wounds of next-door neighbours. It was changing people who you'd only met a few times. It was bringing food to people who you really didn't know. It was stepping in when people had nobody to make sure they didn't die on the streets. And it continues today. I was in Washington Square, as I said, this afternoon, and a memorial has been unveiled to the dead of New Orleans through HIV/AIDS. And I said that it was my privilege to serve as a chaplain at Carl Bean House, the HIV hospice in South Central Los Angeles. And it was even more my privilege to spend the final hours with people there as they were at the end of their lives. And I can tell you that God brought from what we would see as destitution, destruction, and decay, extraordinary things, wonderful things. And let nobody tell you, let nobody ever use somebody else's suffering as a stick to beat your faith in God with. Because I tell you, that right, that decision, that understanding of God is the person's who is suffering. And I sat with people whose lives were anointed and transfigured in the last hour of their life by the presence of God within their last hour. I spent the final hour with people who had been estranged from their families for 30, 40 years, and all was reconciled around Holy Communion in the last hour of their life before they breathed their last. And out of this sorrow, out of this place of death, came some of the most blessed experiences and memories of my life. I still get letters and emails from people who I met briefly as relatives of those who I visited at Carl Bean House. I don't remember it as a place of death. I remember it as probably the most overarching privilege of my life, to have been able to go there and to serve there. Now, I did have something to preach today, besides preaching on the subject of God drawing glory and wonder out of what we see as death and decay. And that was that little thing called free will, because this business of saying yes to God is not just a sideways thing. It is at the absolute core of our Christian life. If we do not understand the significance of us saying yes, and our ability to say yes and know that we have free will, we do not understand our true power, the true extraordinary nature of us as human beings. We are not robots. We are also not angels, amen. How many times do I say in this pulpit, and I say it to myself because I need to remember it, okay? That angels are good because God programmed them to be good. Human beings are above the angels because we have the choice. And when we turn to God, it is a glorious thing. It is a glorious and a wonderful thing. So our free will is not just something that we can take and leave. It is our reason for existing. It is the core of our life on earth. And it is what makes us godlike. It is our godlike inheritance. We are in the image of God because we can create, we can destroy, we can say yes and we can say no. But most of all, we can say yes to God and we can cleave back to the God that spawned us in glory before we were born. God is outside of time. God is neither before us or present or ahead of us. God is outside of time. Now I tell you that because I had a debate on the whole subject of human free will with a very, very nice atheist gentleman who is the head, in fact, of the New Orleans Humanist Society. And he said to me that if you believe that God is omnipotent and omniscient, there can be no such thing as human free will. I thought, well, I don't quite understand that one, but we had another chat, and he said, well, if God knows what we're going to do, we don't really have free will. Well, let me just address that, because that's a common bit of ammunition that's thrown at Christianity. Well, imagine a time traveller going back in time to observe a scene that he already knows what the outcome is. His knowledge does not cause the outcome. He merely observes before the event. The actors in the scene still possess free will, just like people observed behind a double-sided mirror do not suddenly lose their free will because somebody is observing us. Well, God, who exists outside of time, observes our beginnings, our presence, and our ends. We are constrained by what we are and where we are and what we think and how we think, but we really do have to grasp that God is not only omnipotent and omniscient, but God is mystery to us. The mind of God, at best, can be merely glimpsed, but we also have to accept that there are many things we are just not going to know. Now, I tell you that so that you never devalue, and I never devalue in my own mind, the importance of my act of free will. Each and every one of you have made an act of free will in coming here today, and I am eternally grateful you have. Because it is the most demoralizing thing in the world, preaching to 2 or 3 people. Now it's something that I know I still got to do, but I did such a lot of that in the Church of England. Oh. The amount of times we were gathered ready for service, and of course I didn't have free rein. I might have looked a bit like this, but I couldn't do this underneath my robes if I wanted to. And I couldn't preach exactly on what subject I wanted to because people were looking over my shoulder. But we gather for service, and how many times were there more people in the crew gathered to go out than there were in the actual pews? And I began to realise, we're doing this for ourselves. This is for our own entertainment. We'd have a thurifer. Somebody to hold the thurible. The thurifer is a burning handbag, you know, with the incense in it. Somebody to hold the boat, the incense boat, not the thurible thing you swing. There'd be somebody, a crucifer, to hold the crucifix. Then there'll be a master of ceremonies. Then there will be 2 acolytes who are usually holding lamps with candles in them. Often, if it was a high day or a holy day, we would also have somebody to hold something called an umbrellino, which is a very high-camp pink umbrella thing that you hold over the priest, which will be processing with a big monstrance,